December 20th, 1943. 27,000 feet above the German city of Bremen, a B-17 flying fortress named Ye Olde Pub is dying by degrees. The nose has been torn open by a direct flak hit, and the freezing wind screams through the wreckage where the Perspex used to be. One engine is dead. A second is failing. The rudder hangs at a useless angle, shredded by cannon fire. Inside, the tail gunner is dead, frozen in place at his station. The waist gunner has lost consciousness from blood loss. 6 other men are wounded, some of them badly, and the young pilot at the controls, 21-year-old Second Lieutenant Charlie Brown, has taken a piece of shrapnel to the shoulder and is running on will alone. The aircraft has already survived a headlong pass through the middle of an entire German fighter formation, an act of desperation that saved it from a full frontal assault but left it barely flying. It is losing altitude, it is alone, and somewhere below, climbing hard through the winter sky, a Messerschmitt Bf-109 is coming up to finish the job. The pilot of that fighter is Oberleutnant Franz Stiegler, a 26-year-old ace with 22 confirmed kills already to his name, one shy of the number that would earn him the Knight's Cross, Germany's highest award for combat gallantry. He has just landed to refuel and rearm after downing 2 bombers already that morning. He is exhausted, and he is owed a medal. When he lifts off again and spots the crippled fortress limping toward the North Sea, every instinct built by 4 years of war tells him this is an easy kill, the 23rd victory, the one that would change his fortunes. What happens instead, in the next 10 minutes over the fields of northern Germany, has nothing to do with weapons and everything to do with the strange, fragile thing that can survive even inside a war built to destroy it. This is why it matters, because history is not only made by the machines that kill, but occasionally, and unforgettably, by the men who choose not to use them. By the winter of 1943, the campaign that would come to be known as the Combined Bomber Offensive had become a machine of staggering scale and staggering cost. The United States 8th Air Force, flying from bases scattered across the flat, damp counties of eastern England, had committed itself to a doctrine that sounded almost reasonable on paper: daylight precision bombing, hitting factories, oil refineries, and rail yards with tight formations of heavily armed bombers flying close enough together that their combined firepower could, in theory, fight off enemy fighters without an escort. In practice, it was one of the costliest gambles of the entire war. Unescorted formations flying deep into German airspace were routinely torn apart. Missions to targets such as Schweinfurt and Regensburg in the autumn of 1943 had seen loss rates above 20% in a single raid, numbers that, if sustained, would have annihilated an entire bomber force within a few weeks of missions. A crewman flying with the 8th Air Force at this stage of the war had, on average, a worse statistical chance of completing his required tour of 25 missions than a British infantryman had of surviving a full stretch on the Western Front a generation earlier. Long-range fighter escort, the obvious solution, simply did not exist yet in usable form. The P-47. Thunderbolt, the best American fighter available in late 1943, could not carry enough fuel to accompany the bombers past the German border, let alone all the way to targets such as Bremen or Berlin. The P-51 Mustang, the aircraft that would eventually solve the problem when fitted with drop tanks and a British-designed Merlin engine, would not arrive in numbers until early 1944. Until then, the bombers were, in the bluntest sense, on their own once the escorts turned for home. German fighter pilots understood this gap perfectly and exploited it with brutal efficiency, often attacking head-on, where the B-17's defensive firepower was weakest and a burst of cannon fire could kill the entire flight crew in the cockpit in a fraction of a second. The mathematics of survival were unforgiving. A bomber that fell out of formation, damaged and alone, was not merely vulnerable. It was, in the cold arithmetic of aerial combat, almost certainly finished. This was the world Charlie Brown's crew flew into on the morning of December 20th, and it is against that backdrop of near-certain destruction that what followed becomes almost impossible to credit. Ye Olde Pub was a B-17F Flying Fortress, one of roughly 12,700 fortresses eventually built across Boeing's Seattle plant and licensed production lines at Douglas and Lockheed Vega. A four-engine bomber bristling with as many as 13.50 caliber machine guns and capable of carrying just over 3.5 tons of bombs on a long mission. It earned its nickname for its ability to absorb punishment that would have destroyed lesser aircraft, and on this mission, that reputation was tested to its absolute limit. After the bombing run over Bremen's shipyards, a burst of flak had shattered the Perspex nose cone and wounded the navigator and bombardier. As the crew fought to keep formation, waves of German fighters, perhaps as many as 15 aircraft in total, tore into the wounded bomber over a running fight that Brown himself later estimated lasted longer than 10 minutes, an eternity in air combat terms. By the time the fighters broke off, believing the fortress finished, the aircraft had lost an engine entirely, had a second running at reduced power, had its oxygen, hydraulic, and electrical systems crippled, and was carrying a crew in which more than half the men were wounded and one was dead. Brown himself had briefly blacked out from blood loss and altitude before regaining consciousness at the controls, pulling the aircraft out of what should have been a fatal spiral almost by instinct alone. It was into this scene that Franz Stiegler climbed. Stiegler flew with Jagdgeschwader 27, one of the Luftwaffe's most experienced fighter wings, and he had trained under men who held to an older, near-chivalric code of aerial warfare, a code that was rapidly vanishing under the pressure of total war, but had not entirely disappeared. His own squadron commander, Gustav Rodel, had once told him plainly that if he ever shot a man in a parachute, or a defenseless enemy who had clearly surrendered, Rodel himself would shoot Stiegler out of the sky. When Stiegler pulled his Messerschmitt alongside the American bomber, expecting an easy kill, he instead found himself looking directly into the fuselage through the gaping hole where the nose glazing had been, close enough to see the wounded men inside, close enough to see the tailgunner's frozen, lifeless body still hunched at his position. He would later describe the aircraft not as a target, but as something closer to a flying ambulance. He could not bring himself to fire. What Stiegler did instead was extraordinary by any measure. He flew his fighter into close formation on the fortress's wing, matching its speed, in full view of German anti-aircraft batteries and observation posts along the coast who might easily have opened fire on the bomber the moment they saw it was unescorted and vulnerable, unaware that a German pilot was now, in effect, shielding it. Using hand signals through the cockpit glass, unable to speak English and unwilling to risk a radio transmission, Stiegler tried to persuade Brown to land in Germany and surrender, or to divert to neutral Sweden, both of which would have spared the crew a return flight they seemed unlikely to survive. Brown, wary and uncomprehending, refused, ordering his gunners not to fire but holding his course for England regardless. Stiegler escorted the crippled bomber out over the North Sea, past the range of German coastal guns, before breaking away with a final salute, a gesture Brown and his surviving crew would spend decades trying to understand and eventually trying to trace back to the man who gave it. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. German fighter doctrine by late 1943 left little formal room for mercy of this kind. The Luftwaffe, like every air force of the war, prized the destruction of enemy bombers above nearly all else, and pilots were assessed and decorated almost entirely by their confirmed kill totals. Stiegler's own restraint that day, refusing a kill that would have earned him the Knight's Cross, stood in direct contrast to a system built to reward exactly that kill. American accounts of German fighter tactics in this period, and there are many, overwhelmingly describe aggressive head-on attacks pressed to point-blank range, not acts of chivalry, and Stiegler's own post-war recollections make clear he understood how unusual and how professionally dangerous his decision was. Had his superiors learned of it, he faced the very real possibility of court-martial or execution. On the Allied side, there is no meaningful equivalent recorded of a bomber crew sparing a fighter in a comparable position, largely because the tactical situations were rarely symmetrical, but numerous American airmen of the Period did report isolated incidents of enemy pilots declining to finish off aircraft already visibly doomed, suggesting Stigler's decision, while exceptional, was not entirely without echo elsewhere in the war. What set his encounter apart, and what would eventually make it one of the most thoroughly documented acts of battlefield mercy of the entire conflict, was its scale, its duration, and the fact that both men lived long enough afterwards to tell their own sides of it. Ye Olde Pub made it back to RAF, seething in Norfolk, its home base with barely any fuel remaining and its surviving crew in urgent need of medical attention. Brown was debriefed and told, understandably, to keep the story of a German fighter escorting him home to himself, since intelligence officers were wary it might suggest fraternization or, worse, a deliberate German ruse. For more than 40 years, the encounter existed only as a strange, half-suppressed memory. Brown eventually became a diplomat and later gave lectures on the mission, and in the 1980s he began actively searching for the German pilot who had spared his crew, placing notices in newsletters aimed at former Luftwaffe aviators. In 1990, Franz Stigler, then living in Canada, read one such notice, recognized the details of the encounter as his own, and wrote to Brown. The two men met, corresponded, and became close friends for the remainder of their lives, giving joint interviews and appearing together at reunions of the 8th Air Force. They died within months of one another in 2008, Stigler in March and Brown in November, their friendship having outlasted the war that brought them together by more than 60 years. The material impact of Stigler's decision was, in the strictest sense, small. One bomber, 10 men, out of the tens of thousands of aircraft and hundreds of thousands of airmen who took part in the combined bomber offensive. It changed nothing about the war's outcome, nothing about Germany's fate, nothing about the grinding statistical attrition that continued regardless. But its psychological and symbolic weight has grown steadily with each passing decade, precisely because it complicates the tidy moral narratives that wars tend to leave behind. The story has since been examined in books, most notably Adam Makos's A Higher Call, published in 2012 following extensive interviews with both men before their deaths, and it remains one of the most widely cited examples used by military historians and ethicists alike when discussing the limits of duty and the persistence of individual conscience within total war. Parts of the wreckage of Ye Olde Pub no longer survive, the aircraft having been scrapped after the war in the routine disposal of surplus bombers, but Stigler's flight logs, photographs of both men, and Brown's own wartime medals are preserved and occasionally displayed at aviation museums in the United States, alongside interpretive material describing the encounter for new generations of visitors. Return, for a moment, to that sky above Bremen, to a shattered bomber losing altitude with a dead man in the tail and a German fighter pilot climbing to meet it. Every rule of the war being fought that December afternoon said Franz Stigler should have fired. Every incentive of his profession, every expectation of his command, every ounce of training pointed toward a burst of cannon fire and a 23rd kill. He did not fire. Charlie Brown flew a wrecked aircraft home on instinct and desperation, and the story he carried with him afterwards was one he was ordered to bury, and could not. What survived that day was not a victory, not in any sense either Air Force would have recognized on December 20th, 1943. What survived was smaller and, in its way, harder to explain. One man's refusal to become what the war demanded of him, and another man's refusal to let that refusal be forgotten. 10 men flew home who should not have. A friendship formed that neither side of that war was designed to produce. And more than 60 years later, in a war remembered mostly for its machines, for its bomb tonnages and loss rates and production statistics, it is this one unrecorded, nearly court-martial-worthy act of mercy, high over the North Sea, that people still choose to tell.